The summer of 1891 brought a drought to the Mississippi River Valley that had farmers in Ascension Parish praying for rain they would not see for weeks. On a sweltering July night, lightning split the sky above the old Blanchard plantation, and within hours, the mansion that had stood for nearly a century was a roaring inferno. Fire crews from Donaldsonville arrived to find the three-story structure beyond saving. They fought to keep the flames from spreading to the surrounding fields and outbuildings, but the mansion itself was lost. Then, as the third fluminarian collapsed inward with a groan that witnesses described as almost human, something shifted beneath the rubble. The heat had exposed a staircase leading down into darkness. When the firefighters descended into what they assumed would be a root cellar, they found themselves in a labyrinth. Brick archways, ventilation shafts, chambers stretching nearly 200 feet beneath the property. The architecture was too precise to be accidental. This had been built with purpose. The first chamber was 20 feet square, low, ceilinged, the air thick with the smell of old stone and something else that hung in the air like a ghost. Along one wall stood glass, fronted cabinets. Inside, the fire had left twisted shapes that took the men a moment to recognize as surgical instruments. In the center of the room, 17 iron examination tables sat in rows, leather restraints still attached, the material worn thin from decades of use. The walls were covered in handwriting, meticulous, clinical French documenting procedures that made hardened men step back in horror. The fire marshal's report described it as a medical facility of unknown purpose. But the elderly black residents of the parish knew exactly what it was. They had heard the stories their mothers and grandmothers whispered. Stories about what had happened beneath the Blanchard mansion. Stories about what Josephine Blanchard had done to the young women in her care, in the name of profit and science. To understand what happened in those basement rooms, you need to understand the world that created them. In 1834, the land along the Mississippi River between New Orleans and Baton Rouge was some of the richest in North America. Alluvial soil, deposited over millennia by flooding, produced sugarcane so thick it rose above a man's head. The plantations along this stretch were kingdoms unto themselves. Thousands of acres, hundreds of enslaved workers, wealth that would make modern billionaires seem modest. The Blanchard plantation, established in 1803 by Etienne Blanchard, was one of the largest. Etienne had fled Saint-Domingue during the Haitian Revolution, bringing with him French aristocratic sensibilities and a burning ambition to rebuild his fortune. He built a mansion that became legendary. 3 stories of imported marble and mahogany, galleries wrapping around the entire structure, gardens featuring plants shipped from Europe and the Caribbean. But it was Etienne's daughter, Josephine, who would turn the plantation into something far more disturbing than a symbol of wealth. Josephine Blanchard was not what you would expect from a woman in antebellum Louisiana. Born in 1794, she grew up watching her father manage the plantation with ruthless efficiency. By the time she was 12, she was keeping his ledgers. By 16, she was managing the household accounts. She read voraciously history, philosophy, and most notably, medicine. She never married. When her father died in 1828, Josephine inherited everything: the mansion, the land, the enslaved workers, and a debt that had been quietly accumulating for years. She was 34 years old and one of the few women in Louisiana who controlled property worth over $1 million. Her neighbors considered her eccentric but brilliant. She corresponded with physicians in Paris and Edinburgh. She subscribed to medical journals from Europe and America. She attended lectures at the Medical College of Louisiana, sitting in the back row where women were grudgingly permitted. She spoke 4 languages fluently. Her enslaved population considered her the devil in silk dresses. Josephine's first years managing the plantation were a revelation. She fired the overseer her father had kept and replaced him with a man who understood how to maximize productivity. She modernized the sugar operation. Within 2 years, the plantation was turning a profit that exceeded anything EN had achieved. She paid down the debt. She began expanding. But Josephine saw something her father had missed. The most valuable crop on any plantation was not sugar or cotton. It was people. Most slaveholders in the 1820s bought their workforce from the domestic slave trade. Virginia and Maryland operated as breeding grounds, supplying the Deep South with a constant stream of human beings torn from their families and sold down the river. The economics were simple. Buy a field hand for $800, work them until they dropped, and hope they lasted long enough to earn back their cost. Josephine looked at this system and saw inefficiency. Why pay premium prices for workers from Virginia when you could produce your own? Why rely on traders when you could create a self-sustaining workforce that grew more valuable with each generation? Why treat human beings as disposable labor when they could be cultivated like prize livestock? She began her experiments in 1829. That was when construction started on the basement rooms. Local builders thought they were installing expanded wine cellars beneath the main house. Josephine paid well and asked few questions. The project took 14 months and employed 30 skilled masons and carpenters, all white, all paid handsomely, all sworn to discretion. The result was a network of underground chambers that stretched nearly 200 feet beneath the property. Temperature controlled, ventilated through cleverly disguised shafts. Completely invisible from above ground, you could walk across the manicured lawns of the Blanchard plantation and have no idea that beneath your feet were rooms where young women were being systematically transformed into breeding stock. The first woman brought to those rooms was named Charlotte. She was 16 years old, born on the plantation, healthy, and unusually intelligent. Josephine believed intelligence was inheritable and would increase future children's value. Charlotte had grown up thinking she might work in the house, might have a relatively safe position in the hierarchy of plantation life. She could read a little, had learned from the previous mistress's daughter before being sold away. On a spring morning in 1830, Charlotte was summoned to the main house. Josephine herself met her, not unkindly. That was the thing about Josephine. She was not screaming or violent. She was calm, clinical. She explained to Charlotte that she had been selected for an important role. She would receive better food, better clothing, better quarters than field workers. Her children would be trained for skilled positions, would never know the brutality of the cane fields. All Charlotte had to do was cooperate with certain procedures. Then Josephine led her down a staircase, hidden behind a panel in the library, down into a corridor lit by oil lamps, down into rooms that smelled of disinfectant and something else Charlotte could not identify. Fear, maybe, or despair so thick it had soaked into the brick walls. The first room Charlotte entered was approximately 20 feet square. The ceiling was low, supported by brick arches that gave it the feeling of a crypt. Along one wall stood glass, fronted cabinets holding medical instruments, speculums, forceps, devices Charlotte had never seen before and could not name. In the center of the room sat a table, unlike anything she had encountered. A padded leather surface, stirrups at one end, leather straps at precise intervals. Standing beside that table was Dr. Armand de Virox, 56 years old, graduate of the Medical College of Louisiana, a man who had spent 30 years as a physician to New Orleans' wealthiest families. He was about to examine Charlotte's body with the same detached professionalism he might apply to inspecting a horse. What happened over the next 2 hours destroyed something fundamental in Charlotte. Not just her bodily autonomy, though that was certainly violated, but her understanding of what human beings were capable of doing to each other while maintaining perfect civility. Dr. De Vierox spoke throughout the examination. He explained procedures to Josephine, noting observations in a leather-bound journal, commenting on Charlotte's physical characteristics, as if she were not a person lying terrified on that table, but a specimen to be catalogued. Excellent pelvic structure, he noted. Bone density suggests strong constitution. No obvious defects. I would estimate reproductive capacity at 8 to 10 live births, assuming standard intervals and adequate nutritional support. A Josephine stood nearby, watching, making her own notes. Asking questions about optimal timing for conception, dietary requirements during pregnancy, methods for increasing the likelihood of multiple births. They discussed Charlotte's future as if she were a crop they were planning, as if her body was simply a resource to be managed for maximum yield. When it was over, Charlotte was led to another room. This one was smaller, 8 feet by 10 feet. A narrow bed, a chamber pot, a small table with a Bible on it. This would be her home for the foreseeable future. The door closed, the lock clicked, and Charlotte understood that her life as she had known it was over. She was the first, but she would not be the last. Over the next 3 years, Josephine expanded her program systematically. She selected 12 young women from the plantation's enslaved population, all between 15 and 22, all healthy, all possessing characteristics Josephine believed would produce valuable children. Intelligence, physical strength, specific physical features that would command premium prices in urban slave markets. The underground complex grew to accommodate them. Individual cells. A common room where the women did needlework under supervision. A kitchen that prepared specialized diets rich in protein and calcium. A nursery for infants. And at the center of it all, the medical chambers where Dr. De Vierox conducted his examinations and procedures. Josephine's innovation went beyond simply forcing women to bear children. Other plantation owners did that. What made her program unique was the systematic documentation and deliberate genetic management. Josephine kept journals that read like agricultural breeding records. She tracked bloodlines across generations. She documented which pairings produced children with desired traits. She experimented with different combinations, trying to breed enslaved people the way others might breed horses. She maintained meticulous records of every woman's menstrual cycles. Dr. De Vierox examined the women weekly, timing their assignments to what he believed were optimal fertility windows. The men selected for these encounters were chosen based on Josephine's breeding charts, height, strength, complexion, skills. Even temperament was considered inheritable. The men had no more choice than the women. Refuse, and you would be sold to the sugar mills downriver, where life expectancy for field workers was measured in years. Cooperate, and you would receive better rations, lighter work assignments. You would be complicit in a system that was destroying other people's humanity, but you would survive. And that was the genius of Josephine's system. She did not need overseers with whips. She built a structure where survival required cooperation, where the threat of something worse made people participate in their own oppression. In 1832, a woman named Rachel arrived in the basement rooms. She was 17 years old, purchased at auction in New Orleans, specifically for Josephine's program. The bill of sale described her as healthy, intelligent, suitable for domestic service or breeding. That last word, breeding, written right there in legal documents, as if Rachel were livestock. Rachel's introduction followed the same pattern as Charlotte's. The examination. The clinical discussion of her body's reproductive potential. The small cell that would become her prison. But Rachel had something Charlotte had not possessed. Rage. During her first week underground, Rachel refused to eat. She screamed at Dr. DeVerox during examinations. She tore at the leather restraints until her wrists bled. She made it clear she would rather die than cooperate. Josephine's response revealed the calculated cruelty beneath her civilized exterior. She did not beat Rachel. She did not starve her. Instead, she brought another woman to Rachel's cell, a woman named Mary, who was 8 months pregnant and had been part of the program since its beginning. And Josephine explained very calmly that Rachel's cooperation would determine Mary's fate. Continued resistance meant Mary would be sold immediately after giving birth, sold to a particularly brutal planter in Pointe-Coupee Parish. Mary's baby would be sold separately. Mary would die in the cane fields within a year, and her child would grow up never knowing a mother's love. If Rachel cooperated, Mary would remain on the plantation. She would be allowed to nurse her baby, to see that child grow up. It was a choice that was not a choice, and Rachel understood that Josephine would make good on the threat. She stopped screaming, stopped refusing food, stopped resisting. Rachel learned what all the women in the program learned, that survival required a kind of psychological splitting. You separated your mind from your body. You went somewhere else during the examinations, during the forced encounters, during the pregnancies you could not prevent. You built walls inside your head to protect whatever small piece of yourself you could keep sacred. The women developed their own language down there in the basement, coded phrases that let them communicate under the supervision of the house. Servants Josephine assigned to monitor them. They shared strategies for emotional survival. They told stories to each other about lives they had lived before, dreams they still held despite everything. They became a community forged in shared trauma, mothers who would never raise their children, women whose bodies had become battlegrounds in a war they had not chosen. They called it the forgetting ritual. When a child was sold away, the mother would gather with the other women in the common room. They would sit in a circle and tell stories about the child, every detail they could remember, the sound of the baby's first cry, the way the child smiled, favorite foods, small jokes, personality quirks. They would tell these stories for 3 days, memorizing every detail, burning it into their minds. And on the 4th day, the mother would stand in the center of the circle and speak directly to her absent child. She would say everything she needed to say, how much she loved them, how she wished she could have protected them, how she hoped they would survive. She would pour out her heart completely, holding nothing back. And then the other women would help her lock it away. They would remind her that to survive, she needed to separate love from daily reality, that she could keep her child in a sacred place in her mind, but could not let grief destroy her ability to function. Because if she broke down completely, Josephine would consider her unproductive. And unproductive women were sold to the worst plantations in Louisiana. It was brutal pragmatism born of absolute powerlessness. They saved each other by teaching each other how to survive emotional devastation that should have been unsurvivable. Rachel, who had initially resisted so fiercely, became one of the strongest practitioners of this survival technique. By 1838, she had given birth to 3 children. 2 had been sold, the 3rd remained on the plantation. Rachel learned to work within the system while secretly maintaining her defiance. She began to memorize the breeding records. During the hours she spent doing needlework in the common room, she would observe when Josephine brought down the journals to update them. She caught glimpses of pages names, dates, sales prices. She committed everything she could to memory, building a mental archive. Rachel did not have a plan for what she would do with this information. There was no legal recourse, no authority that would intervene on behalf of enslaved women. But some instinct told her that documentation mattered, that if these crimes were ever to be acknowledged, someone needed to preserve the truth. The other women noticed Rachel's careful attention to the records. Slowly, they began contributing their own pieces to the puzzle. One woman remembered the name of a child sold to a particular buyer. Another recalled the date of a specific birth. Together, they created a collective memory that paralleled Josephine's official documentation. They called it the true accounting. In 1846, a Catholic priest named Father Gabriel Rousseau began visiting the plantation quarterly to provide religious instruction. He was a young man, recently ordained, genuinely devoted to his faith, and deeply troubled by slavery's moral implications. When Josephine showed him the underground complex, explaining that these women needed spiritual guidance as they fulfilled their duties, Father Rousseau was horrified. He recognized immediately what he was seeing: systematic sexual exploitation disguised as agricultural management. He confronted Josephine directly. "Madame Blanchard, what you are doing here violates every principle of human dignity and Christian morality. These women are not livestock. They are human souls created in God's image." Josephine's response was calm and devastating in its logic. "Father, I respect your spiritual authority, but surely you understand that the Church has not condemned slavery itself. These are my property under Louisiana law. I am managing my property responsibly, providing excellent medical care, and ensuring these women and their children are well, fed, and healthy. What would you have me do? Release them to poverty and starvation? Abandon my responsibilities as a property owner?" Father Rousseau tried to argue theology and morality. Josephine countered with law and economics. The conversation ended in stalemate. The priest continued his quarterly visits, providing what spiritual comfort he could to the women, but taking no action that would actually disrupt Josephine's operations. This accommodation, this willingness to witness atrocity without intervening meaningfully, would haunt Father Rousseau for the rest of his life. In 1878, as an elderly man, he gave testimony about what he had seen. He described his own moral failure with painful honesty. "I told myself I was helping by bringing them the sacraments. But the truth is, I was too cowardly to do what Christian morality demanded. I should have exposed what was happening. I should have used whatever influence I had to stop it. Instead, I gave Madame Blanchard the veneer of religious approval by continuing to visit. I baptized children who would be sold away from their mothers. I heard confessions from women who had nothing to confess except the crime of surviving. I did nothing to actually challenge the system. I will answer for that cowardice when I face God's judgment." But in 1846, Father Rousseau simply continued his visits. He became another fixture in the underground rooms. The women appreciated his kindness, but they understood that kindness without action was just another form of complicity. By 1850, Josephine's program had been operating for 21 years. The underground complex had produced 127 children. 73 had been sold, generating documented revenue of $67,400, a fortune at the time. The remaining children worked throughout the plantation's operations, or were still too young for productive labor. But something had shifted. The women in the program had begun having children who were themselves born in the basement rooms. This represented the full realization of Josephine's vision, a completely self-sustaining population where every individual had been literally bred for specific characteristics. where genetic lineage could be traced through carefully maintained records, where human beings were cultivated like prize roses. Charlotte's daughter, Desiree, turned 15 in 1852. She had been born in the underground complex. She had never known any life except the plantation. She had grown up watching her mother and the other women go through pregnancy after pregnancy. She understood exactly what awaited her. The day Desiree was brought to the examination room for her first medical assessment, Charlotte had to watch. Josephine required it. She wanted the older women to witness the next generation's incorporation into the system, to understand that the cycle was permanent and inevitable. Charlotte stood in that room and watched Dr. de Vierox, now 70, but still conducting examinations with the same clinical detachment, assess her daughter the way he had once assessed her. She watched Josephine make notes in her breeding journals, calculating which man should be paired with Desiree to produce optimal offspring. Something broke in Charlotte that had survived 22 years of systematic exploitation. That night, Charlotte tried to hang herself in her cell, using strips of fabric torn from her dress. Rachel found her before she died, cut her down, revived her. The other women gathered around Charlotte as she sobbed, not with the careful control they had all learned to maintain, but with complete abandonment. "I can't watch her go through this," Charlotte said. "I can't watch Desiree become what I became. I thought if I survived, if I cooperated, my children might somehow escape this. But they're never going to escape. This is going to continue forever. We're breeding our own children into slavery within slavery." The women had no comfort to offer, because Charlotte was right. The system was designed to be permanent. Josephine had created something that could reproduce itself infinitely. As long as slavery remained legal, as long as the plantation existed, women would be locked in these rooms and forced to produce children who would grow up to produce more children, generation after generation. In April 1861, the Civil War began. At first, the conflict seemed distant from the plantation, but slowly, the war began to disrupt even the carefully controlled environment of the underground complex. Young white men from the parish enlisted in Confederate regiments. The plantation's overseer left to join the army. Josephine struggled to find reliable supervisors. More significantly, enslaved people throughout the South were hearing about Union armies, about contraband camps where fugitives found protection, about the possibility, however distant, that the war might end slavery entirely. Hope, that dangerous thing, began to circulate through the underground community with new intensity. The women whispered to each other about what they had heard from field workers, about Union gunboats on the Mississippi, about plantations closer to New Orleans where enslaved people had fled to Union lines. Rachel, now in her 40s and beyond childbearing age, but retained for her sewing skills and supervisory role, tried to temper this hope with realism. "Even if the North wins, even if slavery ends, we need to be careful," she said. "Freedom won't mean justice. We might get out of these rooms, but we'll still be black women in Louisiana. We'll still be vulnerable. We need to plan for what comes after, not just dream about it." This pragmatic approach to potential liberation revealed the psychological scars the women carried. They had learned not to trust promises. They had survived by expecting the worst. Even the possibility of freedom carried risks they needed to prepare for. In 1862, New Orleans fell to Union forces. Suddenly, federal authority extended up the Mississippi River, getting closer to Ascension Parish. Josephine, like other plantation owners in the region, faced a difficult calculation. Should she remain, trying to maintain control, or should she evacuate inland, taking her most valuable property with her? She chose to stay. The plantation was too valuable to abandon, and she believed that even if Union forces occupied the parish, they would not interfere with property rights. Slavery might be contested on the national level, but surely individual property ownership would be respected. The women heard about New Orleans' fall. They heard about Union troops, and they began to discuss something they had never seriously considered before: the possibility of survival beyond the plantation. This is when Charlotte made her decision. She was 44 years old. She had been in the breeding program since 1830, 32 years. She had given birth to 9 children, 7 of whom had been sold. Her daughter, Desiree, was now part of the same system. Her granddaughter had just been born in the same basement, where Charlotte had spent most of her adult life. Charlotte decided she was done cooperating. During Dr. de Virox's next examination, Charlotte refused to comply. When he ordered her onto the examination table, she said no. When he threatened punishment, she said she did not care. When he physically tried to force her, she fought back with a strength born of 3 decades of suppressed rage. "I am not your animal. I am not your property. I am a human being, and I will not cooperate anymore. Do whatever you want to me, but I'm done pretending this is anything other than rape. I'm done acting like this system is normal." Her screams echoed through the underground chambers. Every woman heard her, and something fundamental shifted in that moment. For 32 years, survival had required cooperation, silence, the appearance of consent to a system that allowed no actual choice. But Charlotte's screams broke that enforced silence. She said out loud what they had all known, but never been allowed to speak. Josephine was summoned. She came down to the examination room to find Charlotte restrained but still screaming. The other women had gathered in the corridor outside, drawn by the commotion. For the first time in the program's history, Josephine faced potential collective resistance. She made a quick calculation. Charlotte was past childbearing age, useful only for sewing work. She was now a liability, disrupting the careful control that kept the system functioning. And with Union troops in the parish, Josephine needed to maintain the appearance that her enslaved people were content. She ordered Charlotte removed from the breeding complex and placed in field work. It was meant as punishment, but it was actually liberation. Charlotte spent her first night above ground, sleeping in a cabin with other field workers, seeing stars for the first time in over 3 decades. The women remaining in the underground complex understood Charlotte's rebellion as a message. Cooperation was not required forever. Resistance was possible, even at great cost. The system that had seemed permanent might actually be vulnerable. On April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox. By late April, news had reached even isolated plantations in Louisiana that the Confederacy no longer existed. Enslaved people throughout the South were hearing the word that would change everything: freedom. At the Blanchard plantation, the news arrived on April 23, carried by a Union officer and 2 soldiers who rode up the main drive. They had orders to register formerly enslaved people, ensure they understood their new legal status, and document plantation conditions for the Freedmen's Bureau. Josephine met them on the mansion's front gallery with perfect composure. She explained that her people had always been well treated, that she had no objection to their freedom, and that she would cooperate fully with federal authorities. She was charming, civilized. She offered the officers refreshment and answered their questions with careful precision. She did not mention the underground complex beneath her feet. She did not volunteer information about the breeding program she had operated for 35 years. But Charlotte, who had been working in the field since her expulsion from the underground complex, approached the officers. She was skeletal thin, her body worn down by decades of forced pregnancies and recent months of hard field labor. But her voice was steady. "Sir, there's something you need to see. Something Madame Blanchard won't tell you about." The officers followed Charlotte behind the main house to the concealed entrance, down the brick stairs into the underground chambers where 34 women still lived, most of them pregnant or recovering from recent births. The officers' shock was documented in their official report filed with the Freedmen's Bureau 3 days later. Wood discovered extensive underground facilities, housing colored women in conditions suggesting systematic forced breeding operations. The women report being confined to these chambers for periods ranging from months to decades. Several women displayed evidence of multiple pregnancies. Medical equipment and examination facilities suggest organized program of reproduction management. Madame Blanchard claims the facilities were used only for medical care and protection, but testimony from the women contradicts this assertion. The women were brought out of the underground complex on April 24, 1865. Some had not seen sunlight in years. Rachel, who had been part of the program since 1832, was 47 years old. She had spent 33 years in those rooms, 1/3 of a century underground. When she emerged into daylight, the sun was so bright it hurt her eyes. She stood on grass for the first time in decades, feeling soil beneath her feet instead of limestone floors. She wept. Not with joy exactly. The trauma of what she had endured could not be erased by liberation, but with relief. With the overwhelming sensation of breathing air that was not filtered through underground ventilation shafts. Pauline emerged with her son Marcus, now 14. She had been on the plantation since 1839, 26 years, 24 of them underground. She had given birth to 7 children. 4 had been sold. 3 remained, including Marcus. The reunion between Pauline and her children was not the joyous embrace you might imagine. The children had been raised to see her as Pauline, not as mother. They had been taught that family bonds were irrelevant, that loyalty belonged to the plantation. Rebuilding those relationships after liberation would take years, and for some families, it would never fully happen. Desiree, Charlotte's daughter, emerged carrying her own infant daughter, 3 generations of one family, all born in the same underground complex. Charlotte held her granddaughter for the first time in daylight and tried to comprehend that this baby would not grow up in those rooms, would not be examined by doctors, would not be forced to bear children for profit. The cycle that had seemed permanent and eternal had finally broken. But liberation did not mean justice. The Union officers documented what they had found, but no charges were filed against Josephine. What she had done was horrifying, but it had not been illegal under Louisiana law during slavery. The breeding program, the underground chambers, the systematic exploitation, all of it had been within a slaveholder's legal rights to manage their property. Josephine faced no punishment. She lost her enslaved workforce, which represented a significant financial loss, but she retained ownership of the plantation. She continued living in the mansion. She attended Mass at the same church. She maintained her position in parish society. She died in 1889 at age 95, wealthy, respected, and unpunished. Her obituary in the Donaldsonville newspaper described her as a woman of remarkable intelligence and business acumen who managed one of the parish's most successful plantations for 6 decades. It made no mention of the underground breeding complex. No mention of the women she had systematically exploited. No mention of the children she had sold. The women who survived received their freedom and nothing else. No compensation for decades of exploitation. No assistance finding children who had been sold. No medical care for bodies damaged by forced pregnancies. no psychological support for trauma that would pursue them for the rest of their lives. This is what freedom meant in 1865 Louisiana, not justice, not restitution, just the technical legal status of no longer being property. Charlotte spent her freedom years searching for her children. She placed advertisements in newspapers. She wrote letters to Freedmen's Bureau offices across the South. She traveled when she could afford it, following leads that might reunite her with the 7 children who had been sold away from the plantation. She found 3 of them. Her oldest son, Thomas, was living in New Orleans, working as a carpenter. Her daughter, Sarah, had been sold to a plantation in Mississippi and died there in 1859 at age 19 during childbirth. Another son, James, had escaped to Union lines during the war and enlisted in the United States Colored Troops. He had survived and was farming in Arkansas. The other 4 children, Charlotte never located. They existed in Josephine's burned breeding records, their births and characteristics noted, their sale prices documented, but their ultimate fates disappeared into the chaos of slavery and war. Charlotte searched until her death in 1883, never giving up hope that she might find them. This became the pattern for most of the women freed from the plantation's underground complex. They spent their remaining years searching for lost children, trying to rebuild families that systematic breeding programs had torn apart. Some succeeded in finding 1 or 2 children. Most never found them all. A few never found any. In 1897, a historian from Boston named Walter Garrison came to Louisiana to document the experiences of formerly enslaved people. He placed advertisements in churches and met with community leaders, seeking people willing to tell their stories. 6 women who had survived the plantation's breeding program agreed to give recorded testimony. Pauline was one of those women. She was 76 years old, living in a small house in Donaldsonville. Her testimony, preserved in the archives of the Boston Historical Society, provides devastating detail about the breeding program's operation. People ask me why we didn't resist more. Pauline told Garrison, "They don't understand the choices we faced. It wasn't between freedom and captivity. It was between one kind of hell and another. Madame Blanchard made sure we knew that resistance meant being sold to plantations where field workers died within a few years, where you'd never see your children, where conditions were even worse than the underground rooms. So we cooperated. We endured the examinations. We bore the children they forced on us. We participated in a system designed to break us. And we found ways to survive that I'm not sure anyone who hasn't experienced it can truly understand. But here's what I want people to know. We were more than what was done to us. Even in those rooms, even during the worst of it, we found ways to love each other, to support each other, to maintain some sense of dignity and humanity. We sang, we told stories. We created community in the spaces between the forced pregnancies and examinations. And we documented everything. We knew Madame Blanchard was keeping records, so we kept our own. We memorized names and dates and sales prices. We preserved truth she wanted to hide. And after freedom came, we wrote it all down so that someday people would know what really happened. Not the sanitized version, not the clinical documentation, but the human truth of what we endured and how we survived. The last person born in the plantation's underground complex died in 1971. Her name was Sarah Mutton. She was born in 1863, just 2 years before liberation. She spent her first 2 years underground, then was freed along with her mother when Union troops arrived. Sarah spent her entire life searching for family members who had been sold before the war. She placed advertisements. She followed leads. She attended reunions where formerly enslaved people and their descendants gathered, hoping to reconnect with lost relatives. She never found her father, who had been sold to Mississippi in 1862. She never found two older half-siblings her mother had born in the breeding program. In 1969, at age 106, Sarah gave one final interview to a graduate student researching Louisiana slavery. She was nearly blind, her memory fragmented. But she remembered her mother's stories about the underground rooms, about the examinations, about the forced pregnancies, about the community of women who supported each other through impossible circumstances. "My mama told me," Sarah said in that interview, "that even in that basement, even when everything was designed to break them, the women found ways to be human, to be kind to each other, to love their children, even when they knew those children would be taken away." She said that was their resistance, that they refused to become the animals Madame Blanchard treated them as. And she told me to remember, to tell my children, to make sure the truth didn't die with her generation. Because the people who did these things, they wanted it forgotten. They wanted to destroy the evidence and let it all disappear into history. But we don't forget. We can't forget. Not just because of what was done to our ancestors, but because of how they survived it. That strength, that refusal to be completely destroyed, that's what they passed down to us. Sarah died in 1971 at age 108. With her death, the last living connection to the plantation's breeding program disappeared. But the story persists, in testimony preserved in archives, in genealogical research, in family histories passed down through generations, in the collective memory of a community that refuses to let these crimes be forgotten. The broader historical significance of breeding programs, like the one at the Blanchard Plantation Challenge, is common. Narratives about slavery. We are taught about slavery as a labor system, about cotton and tobacco and sugar, about economic relationships between North and South, about political debates over slavery's expansion. What we are taught less often is that slavery was also a systematic program of sexual exploitation and reproductive control, that enslaved women's bodies were sites of violence that went beyond forced labor, that children were produced deliberately through calculated breeding programs that treated human reproduction as industrial manufacturing. This was not just the behavior of individual sadistic slaveholders. It was a widespread business model that plantation owners discussed openly and shared with each other. They corresponded about breeding techniques. They traded enslaved men to diversify their genetic stock. They documented their programs with the same attention other businesses might give to inventory management. At least 40 plantations in Louisiana alone operated similar programs. The practice extended to Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, and other southern states. Conservative estimates suggest that between 1820 and 1865, at least 100,000 enslaved women were subjected to systematic breeding programs across the South. Hundreds of thousands of children were born under these circumstances. Millions of Americans today are descendants of people who survived these programs. And it was all legal. Everything Josephine did violated basic human dignity and modern standards of human rights. But it violated no laws. Enslaved people had no legal right to bodily autonomy, no protection from sexual exploitation, no claim to their own children. The law treated them as property, and property rights trumped any consideration of their humanity. The underground complex at the Blanchard Plantation was filled in during the 1890s, when the property was sold. The new owners had no interest in preserving evidence of what had occurred. They leveled the mansion's ruins and converted the land to agricultural use. Today, the site shows no evidence of what occurred beneath its surface. But the evidence exists in other forms. In the written testimony of survivors. In the records Rachel and other women preserved. In genealogical research that traces families torn apart by systematic breeding. In the stories passed down through generations of descendants who still carry the legacy of what their ancestors endured. Charlotte's great-great-granddaughter, a woman named Evelyn Morris, spent 20 years researching her family history. She traced her lineage back to Charlotte, documented the 7 children Charlotte bore in the plantation's underground complex, and tracked what became of them. 3 she located definitively. 2 she found probable matches for. 2 remained lost to history. In 2003, Evelyn published a family history that included Charlotte's story. She described her ancestors' 32 years in the breeding program, the children sold away, the decades spent searching for lost to family after liberation. She documented the intergenerational trauma that affected Charlotte's descendants: depression, anxiety, difficulties forming healthy relationships that persisted across multiple generations. Understanding where we come from doesn't erase the trauma. Evelyn wrote, but it helps us make sense of patterns in our family that otherwise seemed inexplicable. The strength it took for Charlotte to survive what she endured, the resilience she passed down to her children and grandchildren, the determination to document truth and preserve memory. That's what I inherited along with the trauma. The sealed room beneath the Blanchard mansion is gone now, filled in and forgotten by the land above it. But the stories survive. The testimony persists. The descendants remember. The truth, preserved by women who refuse to let it die, remains available to anyone willing to confront it. This is what we owe to Charlotte and Rachel and Pauline and Marie and Sarah and the thousands of other women whose names we do not know, to remember not just what was done to them, but how they survived it. To acknowledge not just their suffering but their strength. To preserve their testimony not as distant history, but as truth that still resonates. Because what happened in those underground rooms was not ancient history. The last survivor died within the lifetime of people still living today. The descendants walk among us, carrying forward the legacy of strength and trauma their ancestors passed down. The evidence exists in archives and family stories and genealogical records. The question is not whether this history exists. It is whether we are willing to face it honestly. To acknowledge the systematic sexual exploitation at slavery's core. To recognize the multi-generational trauma that continues affecting descendants today. To understand that freedom in 1865 did not erase what had been done or heal what had been broken. And to honor the women who survived by telling their stories completely, not the sanitized version, not the comfortable narrative that skips over the worst details, but the full truth of what they endured and how they maintained their humanity despite systematic attempts to destroy it. The women who survived the plantation's breeding program could not tell their stories publicly during their lifetimes. The society they lived in was not ready to hear testimony about systematic sexual exploitation and forced breeding. But they preserved their stories anyway, knowing that someday someone would be ready to listen. That day is now. We have the testimony. We have the evidence. We have the descendants willing to share their families' histories. The question is whether we will honor those women by actually confronting the truth they preserved at such great cost. Because the sealed room exists. It exists in archives and testimonies and family memories. It exists in the genealogical research of descendants tracing bloodlines created by forced breeding. It exists in the collective memory of a community that refuses to forget. And it exists in the stories we tell about American history, about what slavery actually meant, about the systematic exploitation that was central to the system, not peripheral to it, about the women who survived and the strategies they used to maintain humanity in the face of dehumanization. Their stories demand remembering, not to create despair, but to recognize resilience, not to dwell on victimization, but to honor survival, not to forget the horror, but to ensure the truth persists. The women who survived the underground rooms left us a gift. They documented what happened. They preserved truth despite attempts to destroy it. They survived with enough strength to eventually tell their stories. They passed down resilience along with trauma. The least we can do is listen, to really hear what they are telling us across the decades, to acknowledge the full truth of what they endured, to recognize the strength it took to survive, and to ensure their testimony becomes part of how we understand our history. What do you think about this hidden chapter of American history? How should we honor the women who survived systematic breeding programs? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you or challenged what you thought you knew about slavery's realities, please share it with others. These voices refuse to be silenced. Let us make sure they are finally heard.